October 24, 1942. Midnight presses over Henderson Field like a closing fist. In the jungle beyond the wire, 3,000 Japanese infantry move in silence, bayonets fixed, closing in on a muddy defensive ridge held by barely 700 exhausted U.S. Marines. Every rule of warfare said the Marines were already dead, 3-to-1 odds. Veteran assault troops who had steamrolled their way across Asia against a force living on half rations and malaria pills. Military academies taught the same truth. Once combat closes to hand-to-hand range, numbers win battles. And the Japanese had brought 3,000 blades to the fight. The Marines had no armor, no artillery batteries behind them, and no hope of retreat. There was only a thin line of foxholes dug into a soggy ridge between them and annihilation. But buried in the mud behind that ridge were weapons so unassuming that Japanese scouts barely wrote them down in their reports. Small tubes, no moving parts, too light, too simple, too insignificant, or so they thought. What the Japanese didn't know was that those small tubes represented a revolution in infantry firepower, an idea born 19 years earlier in the mind of a French artist who hated war but refused to accept slaughter. Tonight, Edgar Brandt's invention was about to be tested against Imperial Japan's code of death before surrender, and when the jungle finally erupted, nothing about infantry warfare would ever be the same again. The story doesn't begin in the Pacific, or with Marines, or even with war. It begins with an artist. Paris, 1919. While diplomats in silk suits carved up the world in the Treaty of Versailles, a quiet man named Edgar Brandt walked through his metal workshop among curling iron gates bound for embassies and ornate designs commissioned by museums. He was famous in France, not for battle, but for beauty. A sculptor of steel, an artist of the Art Deco age who bent iron like ribbon. But for 4 brutal years, Brandt had put aside art because World War I had turned men like him into weapons makers. He had watched French soldiers throw themselves across open fields toward German trenches, only to be shredded by machine guns before they could even see the enemy. It wasn't bravery they lacked, it was geometry. Artillery fired too far and too flat. Machine guns fired too low and too straight. Heavy mortars existed, but they were so massive they needed horses to drag them forward. There was a deadly gap between infantry and artillery, a gap that had consumed an entire generation of young men. Where generals saw acceptable losses, Brandt saw a design problem. What if, he wondered, every infantry unit could carry its own miniature artillery, not behind the lines, but with them? What if firepower could be simple, portable, and fast enough to follow men into combat? So Brandt sketched a weapon made of almost nothing, a steel tube, a base plate, and a bipod. That was it. No recoil system, no complicated breech, no fancy sighting. Just drop in a shell and let gravity and physics do the rest. A mortar redesigned from scratch. The French army tested his odd little weapon in 1919 and laughed at how absurdly simple it was right before adopting it. Brandt had given infantry something they had never had before: artillery power at walking speed. Other nations noticed Edgar Brandt's invention, but one country didn't just notice it, it industrialized it. In 1931, American observers watched French army exercises and saw a curious thing. Infantry units lobbing precise explosives over hills and into trenches with a weapon so light 2 men could carry it through mud. American officers didn't smile often, but they smiled that day. They knew exactly what they had found: a weapon built for aggressive infantry. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, U.S. Army engineers tore Brandt's 60mm mortar apart. They weighed every part, studied every weld line, and fired so many rounds the test range turned into a lunar crater. The verdict? Simple, reliable, lethal, perfect. In 1932, the U.S. didn't just license it, they bought the full production rights outright. Blueprints, modification rights, everything. They called it the M260mm mortar, a dull name for a weapon that would redefine ground combat. Then American industry did what American industry does. It turned good into unstoppable. They strengthened the sight so it could survive being tossed out of a truck. They refined the firing tables for faster target acquisition. They trained 19-year-old farm boys how to rain explosives like seasoned artillerymen, and they built them by the tens of thousands. By 1941, every U.S. rifle company had a mortar section. By 1942, the M2 mortar went ashore with Marines just like rifles and bayonets, standard equipment. A tool so ordinary, nobody imagined it would soon decide entire battles. And when the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal, they carried these little steel tubes through the surf without fanfare. No one yet knew that these 42-pound weapons would stand between life and death on a muddy ridge facing 3,000 screaming Japanese soldiers. But they would. While the Americans were digging in around Henderson Field, an entire Japanese army was already on the move to wipe them out. At Rabaul, Japanese 17th Army headquarters had been planning the October offensive for weeks. Commanding it was Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, not a flamboyant battlefield genius, but a precise, disciplined organizer who believed victory came from planning and relentless pressure. His objective was simple: capture Henderson Field, destroy American air power in the Solomon Islands, and sever the last line protecting Australia. To do that, he turned to a man with a reputation for doing the impossible: Major General Masao Maruyama, commander of the Sendai Division. These weren't raw recruits. They were hardened veterans who had stormed across China and helped take Singapore, a fortress the British once bragged was untouchable. Maruyama's orders were pure imperial Japanese doctrine: crush the enemy with violence and speed. No holding back, no retreat, no excuses. The plan was textbook Japanese warfare: march an entire infantry division, over 6,000 men, through jungle so savage the Americans believed it was impassable, attack at night, when American artillery and aircraft couldn't help. Hit the weakest point in the Marine perimeter, break through in the first attack, fight to the airfield, finish the enemy. It was a plan built on courage, shock, and momentum, fueled by the unbreakable Japanese belief that death in battle was the highest honor. Every soldier carried not just a rifle, but a code: victory or death. There was nothing in between. But while their strategy accounted for rifles, machine guns, and artillery, it left one gap. No one in Japanese intelligence understood those strange little tubes the Marines had buried in the mud. They dismissed them as support gear, irrelevant, a footnote. They had no idea those tubes would murder an entire army. While thousands of Japanese soldiers crept through the jungle to attack, one man was already waiting for them because he knew exactly where they were coming. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller had been a Marine for 24 years, and in that time he had developed one terrifying gift. He could read a battlefield the way hunters read tracks. He didn't guess where the enemy would attack. He knew. On the southern edge of Henderson Field, Puller commanded 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, about 700 men stretched along 1,000 meters of jungle ridge. It wasn't much. No bunkers, no concrete, just mud, sweat, and discipline. But Puller had turned that ridge into a trap. He placed every machine gun where it would interlock with another. Every rifle squad had clear kill lanes. Every tree and log and gully was measured and studied. And behind the front line, just 200 meters back, he placed the weapons that would decide the battle. 9 M260mm mortars, 3 sections, 3 tubes each, 42 pounds per tube. The most important 42 pounds on Guadalcanal. They didn't look like war-winning weapons. They were ugly, plain things. Just tubes dug into mud. But Puller didn't care about looks. He cared about math and murder. These mortars could drop explosives fast, 18 rounds per minute, and they could hit the jungle almost straight down, raining death where artillery couldn't reach. Each mortar was manned by young Marines, most barely out of high school. They had trained at Camp Lejeune or Camp Pendleton, memorized firing tables, wiped down propellant charges, and now they waited in the dark with stacks of ammo beside them. They had never fired in a real battle. They had never killed a man. Tonight, they would kill hundreds. By 9:30 p.m., scouts reported movement in the jungle, heavy movement. Sergeant Ralph Briggs radioed in from a hidden observation post. About 3,000 Japanese between you and me. Puller didn't panic. He didn't blink. He just gave the order. Stand by to fire. The Japanese thought they were going to overrun a thin rifle line and storm the airfield. They had no idea they were marching into the jaws of a weapon designed specifically to stop them. On October 23rd, Maruyama's men began their approach through the jungle south of Henderson Field, and the jungle began killing them before the battle even started. For 2 days, they hacked, crawled, and waded their way through a nightmare of vines, swamps, and roots sharp enough to slice boots open. It rained so hard weapons had to be wrapped in canvas. Leeches clung to skin. Men slipped down ravines and had to be hauled out like cargo. But the Japanese troops pressed on. They were used to suffering. They were used to hunger. Hardship was proof of worth. They carried only 4 days of rice and no heavy weapons. Their artillery was left behind, too slow for jungle war. This assault would be pure infantry, rifles, bayonets, grenades, and courage, always courage. Maruyama led from the front, setting the pace himself. When his men stopped, they didn't speak. When they ate, it was silent, no fire, only cold rice. Even American Marines would later admit these were no amateurs. These were professionals. By the evening of October 24th, the 2nd Division reached its staging ground just 3,000 meters from the Marine lines. The officers synchronized watches. The plan was simple. First wave, reach the wire, breach it with Bangalore explosives, overwhelm the Marines with bayonet charges. Second wave, exploit the breakthrough. Third wave, drive straight to Henderson Field and finish the job. Attack time, 23 hours. There was no plan for retreat. There was no plan for failure. Japanese doctrine didn't allow either. At 21:30, none of them knew that their quiet approach hadn't been quiet enough. In the trees above them, hidden from view, unseen American eyes had already counted their numbers. The Japanese believed they were the hunters. They were already being hunted. At exactly 23 hours, the night exploded. Japanese artillery, light mountain guns dragged through hellish jungle, began pounding the Marine line. The shells were small, but loud enough to keep Marines ducking in their foxholes. It wasn't a real bombardment. It was a distraction, noise to cover movement. Puller recognized it instantly. He spat into the mud and growled, "They're coming!" "Stand by." Down below, Captain Jiro Katsumata led the 11th Company, 3rd Battalion. Almost 200 men chosen for the first assault wave because they were the kind of soldiers who never hesitated, soldiers eager to die in the right place. Katsumata was only 28, but already a veteran of brutal campaigns in China. He wore his officer's sword like a promise, not a symbol. His men followed him without question, not because they feared him, but because they believed in him. Tonight, he would lead from the front. At 0:15, the Japanese reached the Marine wire. It was worse than they expected. The Marines had built it layer by layer over 2 months, belt after belt of barbed wire, anchored to timber posts and strung with tin cans filled with pebbles to act as alarms. It didn't just slow you down, it tore you apart. The first explosion of a Bangalore torpedo ripped the jungle wide open. A 2-meter gap appeared in the wire, and hell came through. Machine guns opened up from the ridge. 30 caliber Brownings spitting fire into the darkness. Tracers carved bloody arcs through trees and bodies. Japanese soldiers sprinted into the opening and were cut down before they could scream. But they did not stop. Katsumata drew his sword and charged through the gap, shouting above the chaos, urging his men forward. Behind him came wave after wave, moving uphill under torrents of gunfire. They didn't look human anymore, just shadows charging through fire. They were close now, too close. If they reached the Marine line, the fight would turn into bayonets and grenades, and the Japanese were built for that kind of war. They were 50 meters away, then 40, then 30, then the mortars opened. 9 M2 tubes roared from behind the Marine line, and in seconds the jungle turned into a meat grinder. The first volley of mortar fire didn't sound like artillery. It didn't scream, it didn't rumble. It was worse. It snapped. Fast, sharp cracks. 9 explosions detonating almost at once inside the gap in the wire. The Japanese had never heard anything like it. Artillery came from miles away. You could hear it coming. Mortars didn't warn you. The shells came straight down, death falling from the sky. One moment you were alive, the next you were shrapnel. The Marines had pre-plotted the range in daylight. That exact section of wire, the gap now packed with Japanese infantry, had coordinates already written down. All the mortar crews had to do was drop shells into tubes and keep dropping them. Every 3 seconds, another explosion hit the same spot. Men were blown apart. Others were thrown backward, torn open. The gap that was supposed to lead to victory became a furnace of flying steel. Bodies piled on bodies. The mortar rounds didn't just kill, they stopped movement, and in an assault, that was death by itself. Captain Katsumata had already made it through the wire with about 30 survivors still behind him. He turned to look back and saw his company being erased, not defeated, erased, like someone was wiping them off the earth with a paintbrush dipped in fire. He looked forward again, toward the Marine line. It was just 15 meters away. Men were manning machine guns behind sandbags. Rifles flashed from shadowed foxholes. Grenades rolled downhill like metal apples. There was no way out. No retreat. He didn't slow. He didn't think. He didn't feel. He charged. He threw a grenade into the nearest Marine position and rushed forward with his sword raised high. And a burst from a Browning machine gun hit him square in the chest. He fell backward into the mud, still gripping his sword. He had led the charge. He had kept his promise. He had died in front of his men, but not one of them made it past him. By 0035, the entire 11th Company ceased to exist. Katsumata's company was only the first to die. From the south, General Yumio Nasu's 29th Infantry Regiment now surged forward, slamming into the Marine line across multiple points along Puller's sector. These weren't reckless banzai mobs. They were disciplined assault teams, hardened by years of jungle war. They used ravines for cover, pushed machine guns forward, and fired while advancing. This was no suicide rush. This was professional killing. But they had never faced a defense like this. Every time a Japanese unit massed for an attack, the mortars found them. Every time they tried to regroup, another wave of shells fell. The jungle became a maze of craters, shredded trees, and burning bodies. Marine riflemen could see them silhouetted against the flashes, shapes breaking through the dark, falling, more shapes, falling, endless. Second Lieutenant Joseph Turchi and his mortar crews worked like machines. Their arms shook from fatigue, faces blackened with grime and sweat, but they never stopped dropping rounds. They didn't need to see targets. Forward Marines shouted corrections. 50 meters left. Walk it down the line. Short bursts. Keep it hot. They were firing danger close, less than 50 meters from friendly troops, so close that one bad adjustment would kill Marines. Puller didn't care. He had given one standing order hours before. If they break through, fire on my position. By 1:30, the Japanese assault had become a slaughter. General Nasu himself crawled forward with his command group, trying to reorganize the attack. Communications had completely collapsed. Units vanished into the dark and never returned. Runners disappeared before delivering a single message. Then a single mortar round, just one, landed in the wrong place at the perfect time. It hit Nasu's command post. The blast tore through his staff. Nasu was hit in the chest by shrapnel. Carried into the trees by his aides, he died soon after. With him died any remaining coordination. What had begun as a planned, disciplined assault now broke into isolated companies charging alone into gunfire they couldn't overpower and explosions they couldn't escape. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. They kept coming. Because their orders had never included another option. By 3 o'clock, Marines along the ridge were running low on ammunition, soaked in mud and blood, and fighting with a calm kind of desperation. The Japanese were still attacking in fragmented waves, crawling over the dead to get within grenade range. The air smelled like dirt, smoke, and iron. Men fired until their rifles were too hot to hold. Puller got on the radio. "Send me everything you've got." What he got was the U.S. Army. Marching forward through the darkness came Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hall and the 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry Regiment, National Guard soldiers from North Dakota and South Dakota. The Marines had mocked them when they first arrived on Guadalcanal, called them farmers with rifles, said they didn't belong in the Pacific. Now these same soldiers walked calmly through incoming fire to reinforce Puller's flanks, carrying more M2 mortars and ammunition. No hesitation, no panic, no questions. They dug in and got to work. The Japanese didn't expect fresh defenders. They expected a broken line. Instead, they ran headfirst into more guns, more mortars, and fresh American troops ready for their first real fight. Within minutes, Hall's mortars were firing side by side with the Marines, doubling the rate of explosive fire raining down on the Japanese approach.
The ridge wasn't weakening. It was getting stronger. For the first time all night, the Japanese weren't gaining ground. They were losing it. By 4 o'clock, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Japanese had thrown more than 3,000 men against Puller's line. They had charged through wire and fire, over piles of their own dead, into machine gun belts that never stopped feeding and mortar blasts that fell faster than rain. But they never broke through. Not once. They believed courage could conquer firepower. They believed spirit could overcome steel. They believed enough men with bayonets could tear a hole through anything. But Edgar Brandt had changed the math of war. His simple weapon, a steel tube, a base plate and a bipod, had done what artillery and machine guns alone could not do. It stopped an army from reaching bayonet range. It broke the attack before it could become a close fight. It protected infantry instead of abandoning them to slaughter. Brandt's mortar didn't roar like artillery. It didn't inspire poetry or parades. It didn't even look dangerous. But on that ridge at Guadalcanal, dug into the mud 7,000 miles from Paris, it saved an airfield and decided a battle, and in the process, it quietly rewrote the future of warfare, proving once and for all that in modern combat, the side that controls the air above the battlefield doesn't always need airplanes. Sometimes all it needs is 9 little steel tubes and the men who know how to use them.